of our ADA series. We've had 6 parts that we've planned and 3 that have taken place. This is a benefit to the community in part from the Statewide Independent Living Council. They provided us with a grant to host these events, and we've been really excited to do so. We had one on service animals, and all of these probably would be available to anyone who wanted the PowerPoints. Service animals, we've done Title I employment provisions, and then we also did last month accessible documents, which is really, really critical. I think you're going to see a lot more activity when it comes to accessible documents. And then today, of course, we're going to talk about the legal mandates for Title II and Title III. And there's a lot of information, and I'm going to try really hard to get through all of it. I do tend to talk a little fast. I'll be mindful of my pace, especially because we are having the opportunity for someone to join remotely, and we're having this recorded so that it can also then be uploaded and closed captioning can be put on it for someone to view otherwise. So with that in mind, when you have a question and you raise your hand, I'm going to repeat that question because it's going to be going into the computer. They can't actually hear it in this room. It's taken us a lot of time to figure out this big configuration. So I'll just be repeating your questions so that everybody is on the same page. All right, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is the most comprehensive piece of civil rights litigation for people with disabilities. What that means as a civil right, next slide. It was passed in 1990, and its goal, full inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of American life. Now, as a civil right, it's important to understand that since 1990, it's been up to advocates, it's been up to individuals who are willing to bring forth some pressure and some push to make sure accessible features are put into both Title II, public entities, and private accommodations. What I'm saying is, it's a civil rights that it doesn't have ADA police, right? It's self-enforcement. It's people who are advocates and who want to promote the protections of the ADA who actually push along the implementation to some degree. And there's been lots and lots of litigation that goes on in order for states and local governments to understand what their legal mandates are, and then also with private businesses. Next slide. There are 5 titles to the ADA. Title I deals with employment provisions for private employers. Title II deals with accessibility in public entities, program and physical accessibility, and also has employment provisions for people as it relates to public entities as well. So if you are a public service person or an employee of a state or local government entity, you have the same rights and protections as if you're a person with a disability to the employment provisions under Title I. They're just captured also under Title II, telling you to go back to Title I to look at that. It's a little complicated, but just know that as employees of a state and local government entity, you do have the protections, private employer protections as well. Accessibility in businesses, physical, programmatic accessibility in things such as restaurants, hotels, stores, places of business. Telecommunications, telephone communication systems for the public, so things like 911 needs to be accessible. And then miscellaneous, and miscellaneous Title V really has the protection against retaliation. So anyone who's actually trying to fight for their rights and protections under this law, if they are in some way retaliated against for doing so, the protections also include them. And so for today's conversation, we are going to focus on Title II and Title III. And as I said, just a little bit about the employment provisions because they do overlap. Next slide. Why was the ADA needed? Well, if we all think back to before 1990, those of us who were old enough, perhaps, there were fewer curb cuts. Many businesses were not accessible. People with disabilities were rarely seen in advertisements or TV. Interpreters were rarely used in public events. And people with disabilities were excluded from many activities due to barriers. these are all findings that were captured in the legislative history when they enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act again. Over and over again, they found that people were excluded from aspects of all daily life because of their disability, because of whether it's programmatic barriers or there were physical structure barriers. Next slide. So I just want to give you a quick overview of some of the legislative timelines, so you have a kind of a sense of different laws as they relate to people with disabilities. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, but it did not include people with disabilities. And then in 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act was passed, which was the first to address architectural structures to become more usable by individuals with disabilities who use wheelchairs. And then 1973, the Rehabilitation Act came into effect, and that really was a legal mandate for federal governments to not discriminate against people with disabilities. So the federal government really has had a legal mandate to provide accessibility much longer than private businesses and state and local government entities. And then in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which deals with individual students in the school setting getting a free, appropriate public education. We had in 1986 the Air Carriers Act, and then the Fair Housing Amendments Act in 1988, followed by, in 1990, again, the most comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. So what we found in the course of 18 years is that the courts were really narrowly focusing their rulings and their considerations on the person's disability as opposed to the discriminatory conduct that may or may not have taken place. And so there was a big push then to say, hey, look, we need to revisit the Americans with Disabilities Act. We need to look at how courts are interpreting and see if there's ways that we can shift the focus back, if you will, towards the ultimate goal of the ADA. And then that is where, in 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Amendments came into play. So we have ADA and we have ADAA. So all these in acronyms. Next slide. All right, so who is covered? In order to be an entity that is got the legal mandates of the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you're a public entity, you, if you're a private employer, you have to have at least 15 employees working for you in order to be required to follow the ADA. Now, you can voluntarily follow it, like our organization. We well surpassed our 15 employees, but we voluntarily put it in our handbook a long time ago that we would abide by the ADA. Now, public government agencies, regardless of whether they receive federal assistance, are covered by the ADA. And I remember when I was first starting out, I just got out of law school and I was working for a place called Michigan Protection Advocacy Service. And we did a courtroom survey to see what kind of courts were accessible throughout Michigan. And we had one judge who responded saying, I don't have 15 employees, I don't have to follow this law, which he was totally wrong. It doesn't matter the size of the public entity, they automatically always have to follow, including judges, including courtroom facilities. And then again, private operated commercial entities. And so those are your hospital, or your restaurants, your hotels, your theaters, golf courses. And then, of course, we're starting to get into, not starting, but e-commerce, right? The idea of making sure platforms are accessible to people with disabilities, whether it's a visual impairment or maybe a cognitive impairment. And then those that are exempt are private clubs and religious organizations. And there are some exceptions to that. Say, for instance, a church may have won a grant to bring in some federal funding to have a daycare center for the community. That may trigger them to follow not necessarily the ADA, but accessibility requirements under Rehabilitation Act of 1973, because that attaches to any entity that gets public assistance, right? So there are some exceptions. And then the private club exception is really, is it truly private? Meaning that have you really restricted your your membership. Is it a membership, or are you just now claiming it to be some type of private membership? And so that too can be litigated to some extent. All right. So what is ADAAA, the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act? That was in 2008. It became effective in 2009, and then the regulations became effective in 2011. One thing to note about when we're working with understanding the ADA, that so you have the law, and it has certain mandates that you must follow, but then each agency, there's different agencies that are tasked with the regulations, right? So you go to EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to look at their regulations as it applies to employment provisions. You go to Department of Justice to look at what they say about Title II and Title III of the ADA, right? And then you might go to the Department of Transportation as it relates to the transportation provisions of the ADA. And then it goes even a little bit further to say things like the Air Carriers Act has its own Department of Transportation regulations as it relates to people who can travel in Amtrak's or Greyhounds and that kind of over-the-road public transportation. And yes. The Air Carriers Act does include, yes. And so there would be separate regulations. Yeah. Okay. So why was it passed again? The overall purpose was to restore the intent and protections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the U.S. Supreme Court rulings narrowed the definition of disability, and so they wanted to shift the focus back towards the discriminatory behavior. And so what was happening is people were filing lawsuits saying, hey, this is discriminatory. I've been denied access to this benefit or this service or this private business's goods and services or products. And what would happen in the case is they'd say, well, you're not necessarily a person with a disability, so you're not qualified, and this case can't go forward. So they're finding a lot of dead ends to people actually being able to see what are those protections play out in the courtroom setting, because they'd be dismissed in a summary judgment. You're not qualified, you're not qualified. And so really, again, the ADA Amendments Act said, no, we want to make it a little broader for people to understand what a disability is. And so that the focus really does get to what's that discriminatory action that's going on? Is it discriminatory in nature? How do we define that? What does that look like? Next slide. So it restored the definition and protections, but the definition itself did not change in terms of what a disability is. It still is, well, we'll get to that. Next slide. So the definition of person with a disability under the ADA, and it was very much based on the language from the definition under 1973 Rehabilitation Act, is that an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, an individual who has a record of such an impairment, or an individual who is regarded as having such an impairment. And so this definition did not change. But what it did was it expanded the definition by saying now an impairment need not prevent, significant, or severely restrict performance of a major life activity. It has to simply be an impairment that restricts someone's major life activity. And now disability shall be construed in favor of a broad coverage, should not require an extensive analysis. And so basically what they're saying is this, if an individual can say that they are restricted in some way because of a physical or mental impairment that is related to a major life activity, then they are considered a person with a disability. Next question. So before there was in this whole debate about, well, this person, can they work, they're having a hard time being on the assembly line, but at home they can do their laundry, they can cook, they can clean. Does that really mean that they're really limited in some major way, a major life activity? One would argue that yes, there's an accommodation that's needed at work. It may not necessarily be the same accommodation needed at home. They wanted to get away from all those kind of analysis and just get back to some basics. Next slide. Next slide. All right, So substantially limited, as I said, was redefined. And then they included into major life activities to include major bodily functions. And part of this was the idea that, individuals with, say, autoimmune disorders wouldn't necessarily have a major life activity, but their bodily function may have a major life activity. For instance, Bragdon v. Abbott is one of the more popular or well-known cases where an individual was found to be an individual with a disability because of his HIV status, because his major bodily function, the ability to reproduce, was limited. So he was considered to be a qualified individual with a disability. And then one of the bigger things that the ADA Amendments Act did was it affected the mitigating measures. So what was happening is we would have these cases. There was 3 different cases called the Sutton Trilogy, where the courts found that these individuals who had corrective lenses, when they had the corrected lenses, they were fine to see and could be a pilot, but they had to look at them in their mitigating measure because they didn't have a problem seeing. They said they weren't qualified. So it was a catch-22. Without the glasses, they couldn't see enough to be a pilot, but with the glasses, they were no longer considered a person with a disability. So it was this really catch-22 that we really wanted to get away from. So they absolutely said cannot be considered in determining a disability. So if, in fact, someone has regulated medication for diabetes, for instance, and it's fine, it's under control, but they have something else that comes up, they're not going to say, well, you're no longer someone who has diabetes because your medication has taken care of that, or it's maintained by medication, right? They're going to look at that person, they have diabetes, it certainly has, if it has a major life activity that is somehow limited, then that person would qualify. And then it went on to say that impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would stand substantially limiting when active. So there's been some court cases about individuals with cancer and other types of things where if it's in remission and there still is some level at which there's a major life activity that's limited, regardless of the remission status, it would still be an individual who's qualified. Or also with an episodic, that something comes on, perhaps someone with a mental health issue who there's times when it's better and it's worse, and so in those situations you wouldn't necessarily find them to be not a person with a disability because that episode itself isn't happening at that very moment. So it did a lot to really broaden the definition and really soften the court ruling that was so narrowly focused, and then would take away again, that attention towards the discriminatory behavior. So I just put up here and in your slides is a list of different types of disabilities that consistently meet the definition. Next slide. And then impairments that would not include temporary non-chronic impairments, short duration with little or no residual effects. So someone who breaks their leg and needs an accommodation to perhaps wants to use the handicap parking sign or something that's not a good example. That would be employment. Hang on. So there's some cases where they have like an impairment where it's a broken leg or a sprained ankle or something that's not necessarily long duration. Certainly there's maybe certain breaks that happen that if they're over a year, perhaps there's some courts that suggest in those situations that might be a little different, but it'd be more of an individual basis that they would determine that. Major life activities, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending. I think of my morning routine, and there's probably like, 10 of those things that I do just getting up in the morning and on my way. Next. And then thinking, communicating, sitting, reaching, interacting with others, working, breathing, reading, concentrating, thinking, speaking. So again, a very broad scope in terms of what is a major life activity. Next slide. And then again, I said that it expanded to include major bodily functions, immune system, normal cell growth, digestion, bowel, bladder, brain, circulatory, vascular, neurological. And then, again, the episodic disabilities, when considered even in remission, could be something like epilepsy, bipolar disorder, cancer, asthma, those types of disabilities. And as I said before, a mitigating measure is not considered when determining their disability, but for purposes of understanding, a mitigating measure is any device, measure, or medication that reduces the effects of the disability. The positive effects of mitigating measures, except for ordinary eyeglasses and contact lenses, are ignored when determining whether an individual is substantially limited. Okay, so I went through that first part a little in more detail because there are employment provisions that are attached to Title II of the ADA, and again, you refer back to the EEOC regulations when it comes to those protections specifically. Now we're going to get into state and local government, public entities, or public services, and what their legal obligations are under the ADA. Next slide. All right, so they must provide full program access to people with disabilities. So program access, whether it is a township hall meeting, whether it's a library event, whether it's how they send out their absentee votes, their polling places, programs and services across the board, parks, recreation centers, whatever a state and local government entity is involved in, they have to provide full access. Next slide. And again, it's any type of state or local governmental entity that is covered. So again, we're talking about any type of township, municipality, executive leadership, or judicial branch, state or local government entities as well. Next slide. So one of their first obligations in a programmatic sense is that they have to provide reasonable modifications. Public entity is obligated to provide reasonably modify its policies, practices, and procedures to avoid discrimination. And so, for a long time, there was a lot of no dogs allowed, no animals allowed, and so they had to work through this service animal, and so lots of modification to policies came about as a result of that. But there are also other ways, like, Secretary of State's office. It used to be, way back when, before apps were involved, that, you go to the Secretary of State's office, you plunk your little number, and you sit down, and you were just at the mercy of waiting, right? And there really wasn't any exception to that. Well, then there was this push to say, look, you have to modify your policies so that someone could call up and make an appointment. If it's a medical concern that they can't sit there for that period of time, whether it's a mental health condition, perhaps, that doesn't allow them to stay in a crowded area. So they had to look at their practices and ways that they could modify it to allow that access to happen. So it can really be things that are very concrete, like if you have a no service animal policy, you need to change that. Or it can also be in the practices in which people are performing their access to services and programs. So when it comes to reasonable modifications, there are also other types of mandates that come along with it. So they can't deny the services and benefits to an individual. So they can also not screen out an individual with a disability. So perhaps you have a daycare center that's run in a recreation center. We just did an access review of a center in Warren, and they had a daycare center there, right? So covered by Title II. And what if they said in that daycare center that, look, we're not going to have any medications. We don't want to deal with any medications. So if you're coming in to access this daycare center, your child has to be medication free. Well, that would tend to screen out kids with disabilities. It would be an eligibility criteria that would discriminate because it's screening out kids who may have a disability. So those types of things, they're not allowed to do that, and they have to look at ways in which they could ameliorate that screening out process. Another example, there was actually a court case where when judges fill out for the commissioners their application, there's a lot of information they have to disclose, and one of the pieces of information is about their physical and mental health, right? And their capability of duration of being on the bench and for periods of time. Well, they were finding that one of the questions that was being asked was, tell us if you had any hospitalizations since you were 16 years old. Have you had any bouts with rehabilitation or treatment centers in the last, since you were 16 years old? They were asking very open-ended questions that the court found to be unnecessary inquiries that necessarily would, of course, screen out or could have the effect of screening out people with disabilities. And so in those types of situations, the courts have said, no, you need to modify that. You need to eliminate those questions from perhaps any type of application or eligibility criteria for someone to access the program. And then the reasonable modification, there's this mandate that in order to provide programs or services, you must do so in the most integrated setting possible, right? And so what we found, there was a case, Olmstead case, maybe you guys heard that word, but essentially this case was really directed towards the policies and practices at that state level, where they found state funding biases. And essentially what they were doing is saying, states will give money to care for people in institutional settings, but that money will not follow the person into the community, right? So if you leave the institution, you're not necessarily going to get the same amount of care on a financial aspect comparison that you would have gotten had you stayed in the institution. The courts, people challenged that in court, and the courts ruled that, look, the ADA mandates most integrated setting possible. So if you have any type of state funding biases that would say, we're going to give you more to stay in an institution versus being in a community, that's illegal to do. So they have to address those practices and those procedures and make sure that they provide for the same type of services in the most integrating setting, and so that can be in the community. And so there's been a lot of cases. Michigan has had an Olmstead team for many years trying to implement this, even at our level. So, and there was a while back, been in this community for a long time, and there was a while back where they were closing a lot of the institutions, Clinton Valley Center and a couple of others, where there was a big push to say money should follow the person, right? So those individuals going out into the community from the institution, those institutions are closing. Well, where's that money going? And it was going right back to the state, not necessarily to look at community programs. And so that was under the Engler administration, and I remember us really working hard to push to see and make programs be at a home and community setting. And then also they have an obligation to not impose a surcharge, right? So if someone is looking to, for instance, wants to get a handicap placard, and that's their way of being able to park in the community, well, the city is going to maybe tack on a fee for that placard. That's a surcharge, and it's illegal to do so. So looking at anything that, if someone comes in and says, well, I really need to use, if they have some type of assistive technology, say, for instance, they have something where somebody could put a microphone on and they could hear in an event or a training, and they say, well, yeah, we can let you borrow that and use that, but it's going to cost you $15, or we want a $15 deposit up front. All that's illegal to do. You cannot have a surcharge in order to provide access, equal access to a benefit or service of that public entity. Yes?
I have a question. How about cost prohibitiveness? So, for example, I am builder in County, and we have a government entity that has a $10,000 grant to offer a one-day training, a full-day training for hunters. And it's a voluntary thing. And an individual needs American Sign Language interpreters at a cost of $1,000 for one day. Are they expected to accommodate that under the $10,000 grant?
That's a really good question. So just again, for purposes of our recording, I'm going to repeat it real quickly. So the question is, can a state entity who gets a grant to provide a certain program say to someone who needs an interpreter, hey, no, that's cost prohibitive. We can't have at $1,000 a day you take advantage of this program because really the grant's only $10,000, right? Seems like a reasonable kind of observation to make, but unfortunately, what the ADA says is that you can't just look at that grant budget. You look at that public entity in its entirety. And where this comes up a lot is in the college setting, right? Well, we have a certain budget for our disability services office, and this is what our budget looks like. But it's Michigan State University, who's a multi-million-dollar university, right? So they can't do those type of artificial financial barriers or segregating that funding. So no, that would have to go through. And how that would play out is someone would say, hey, look, I need an interpreter. And they say, okay, well, let's look at our program. And is the material so sophisticated that someone couldn't just write back and forth? And likely it can't if it's a one-day gig, right? But they could look to see if there were other things they could provide other than the interpreter. But if in the bottom line it's the only way they're going to provide effective communication, they have to provide it. And again, they can't come back and say this is cost prohibited if it's like the city of Warren that has a budget, that's in the millions. So they cannot have a surcharge, right? Right. You're welcome. Great question. Okay. And that kind of bleeds right into effective communication. So one of the ways in which a public entity has to ensure that they're providing access to all their goods and services is through effective communication, and that's auxiliary aids or services. Can be an interpreter, can be a reader, can be large print material, can be braille material. Today it's digital material, right? So there's lots of ways in which someone can provide effective communication. Now, where this gets sticky sometimes, and this is, I'll give you how it works out in the law, is that much like in the example we were just talking about, someone comes in and says, I need a certain speech-to-text software program, and it's the only program that I know, so it's the only program that I can work with. It's the only thing that's going to be effective for me, and you've got to purchase that in order for me to use, your library reading terminal. And so in that situation, they might find that the library found a free text-to-talk software program. And it may be that this individual, if there's some adjustment in listening to it, but otherwise, they can look to see if there's something other available. And what they kind of play out in the court is that person isn't entitled to their Cadillac version of an auxiliary aid or services, but they're entitled to what is effective, right? So if this person came back and said, look, that free platform doesn't work and here's why, it may be that deserves another discussion. But if it will work, then that's all they have to provide, right? Yep. Right. Yeah, and you can understand an individual. I mean, if they're so used to a certain thing, that's their comfort zone, right? But unfortunately, the law is pretty common sense, and it's going to strike that balance. Because otherwise, the library may have 3 different types of programs for speech to text based on who might have asked for it. And so at some point it might become unwieldy, right? Yes, very much so. Okay, and so then real quickly, obviously personal services and devices, they do not have to offer those. Many times now you might see a scooter or a different wheelchair at the entrance of a township or a council just as a courtesy. That's fine, but they don't have to necessarily provide that to an individual. That might include like hearing aids, those kinds of things, personal, if they need someone to navigate a building, have a personal escort, that isn't necessarily something that the public entity needs to provide. One of the things that I will share with you, when I was looking through the case law, there was a case where a gentleman sued the City Recs program because of the temperature of the pool water. And he was saying because of his type of disability, the pool temperature had to be raised to a certain degree in order for him to access that. And the court very clearly said, look, that's personal in nature. That's not necessarily some type of accommodation or modification that we can make. And the degree at which you're asking us to turn it up may be a safety or health risk to another individual. And so, so there's many times where those personal devices in nature can get tricky as to what they are and how they play out. Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. So that's a great question. They don't necessarily have to provide things that are personal in nature, but if they do, like a scooter or some other type of operable equipment that's available to any customer who walks through the door, no questions asked, it's considered an accessible feature. And what the ADA says is you need to maintain those accessible features, and if you don't do so in a reasonable time and manner, then you're discriminating, right? If the elevator's always broke, that takes you to that second floor. If the device that you use or the program you use at the local library, that terminal is somehow shut down and isn't working for weeks on end. So you have to maintain those features once you have them, right? And so it does, it's a great courtesy, but they've now put themselves at a level of you're going to provide it, then you need to maintain it, right? So that's a good question. Okay. Next one. Slide. Okay, so physical requirements, public entity services and programs, when viewed in their entirety, must be readily accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities. And so they cannot deny access because their facilities are inaccessible. It may mean that they need to modify or they need to change the location for certain things. Say, for instance, when I lived in the Upper Peninsula, Negaunee would have a town hall meeting on their second floor of their old historic building, and by no means was it accessible, right? And so, of course, when contacted and asked if they would relocate, they were like, well, nobody ever comes to our meeting who uses a wheelchair. Really? Wonder why? You're on the second floor. You have no elevator. So in that situation, we asked them to relocate it to a venue that was accessible, because you weren't necessarily going to get them to modify a building that was historic in nature, but they did still have the same obligation to they still had the obligation to provide access to that town hall meeting and the discussions that were going on. All right, so when it comes to program accessibility and you talk about when viewed in its entirety, a lot of times there is discussion about, okay, so you have a certain entity that holds, perhaps they hold a lecture series, right? And they hold it in a certain location of their city, like if it's at a, we'll pick on Warren. Warren has a recreation facility and they have a huge auditorium in this place. And so they choose that as the venue for this, this event. And so someone would say, if it's the only event that you've got, it has to be accessible. But if they were running multiple training events, repeating the same topic of information, it could go to different locations. They don't have to make every single one of those locations available, just as long as that program is accessible at some location, right? Now this gets tricky a little bit because, again, it's when viewed in its entirety that someone who may say, look, I'm from Oakland County, and yeah, you're doing that in multiple venues around Oakland County, and thank you, county, but I'm about 100 miles away from the accessible location when the inaccessible location is 5 miles away, right? So in that situation, there may be some argument that it isn't when viewed its in entirety if you're making someone incur this long distance to get from one location to another. So it just depends on where they're being located geographically, how that might play out for somebody. And again, it's really handy with when and viewed in their entirety because that's where you capture that funding, right? You can't put artificial limits on certain budgets. It has to be viewed in its entirety. Okay, next slide. Program accessibility, obviously buildings and any entity or facility that a public entity has built since 1992 has to be accessible according to the ADA guidelines and or the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. Now, I can tell you Michigan has kind of been able to keep up a little bit in that they tried for a while to bring some of their provisions, they have Michigan Barrier Free Code, to match those of the accessibility guidelines when it comes to architectural structures. And what's important about saying that is when I started this training, we talked about the ADA being a civil rights, right? And there's no ADA police. So you might have a building that's gone up, that a public entity has built, that somebody has signed off for occupancy, that you now are visiting for the first time at public, and guess what? There are certain features that are not accessible. Well, how could that be, right? Because ADAG is federal guidelines, and your local township compliance officers are looking at local state compliance issues, right? And so the more that we could get the Barrier Free Act to mirror those guidelines in the ADA, we were technically going to have some ADA police because your local enforcement officers would then have that. We've got to follow the same standard because it exists in both the feds and the state code. So there still may be, and there probably likely are, places that are not accessible that have been built since 1992. And again, it really gets back to being able to say, you know, are there advocates out there who are going to push this issue and make this place accessible, look at putting some pressure on certain entities.
So what about like new restaurants that are not accessible?
Right. So restaurants are under Title III. We're on Title II, but the same thing. In terms of Title III, 1993, they should have been accessible, any new type of building. And then with the ADA Amendments Act came some other guideline registrations. So even buildings built after 2009 had some stringent accessibility requirements, but again, it's that gap between what's at the local level required, and the only people who are truly going to sign off on occupancy are those compliance officers, right? They're not inviting us in to go, hey, want to take a look and see if it's accessible before we open it up to the public? It'd be great, but it doesn't necessarily happen. Yes?
What about historical buildings?
Right. So historical buildings, they are, I hesitate to say exempt because they're not exempt, but if in fact they're on, and you need to, it depends on what historic registry they're on, right? It could be local, state, federal. But the bottom line is, if in fact they're on a historical registry that says you cannot do anything to the physical integrity of this building because otherwise you'll eliminate the very nature of it, then they have to look at ways that they can still make it open. So for instance, if you had a historic museum and you couldn't provide physical access, you might do pictures and then do an audio for someone to then listen and look at the pictures as they go, or some other way in which that person can benefit from what other artifacts and displays or collections that might be available in that place, right? But I will say that it's tricky when it comes to that historic registry because you really got to know all the twists and turns about what's required, right? And so if someone just goes, we're a historic building, I wouldn't end at that necessarily because it does deserve a little more looking into to see what can you do, right? It may be that the front side of the building needs to maintain its integrity, but you can throw a ramp on the back, right? So it really just depends on what that looks like. Very good question. Okay. Next slide. All right. So each facility or part of a facility that's altered on behalf of the use of a public entity in any manner that affects the usability shall, to the maximum extent feasible in the altered portion, provide readily accessible access. So if a public entity makes some type of alteration, then whatever that alteration is, if it's, we'll pick on again Warren, we wanted them to change their auditorium a little bit. It needed some disbursement and lines of sight, that kind of thing. Now, if they were to make those alterations and it affects the usability of that room, then they need to make the path of travel also accessible, right? So from the parking lot to that room. So it may be that certain public entities might do things like painting or re-roofing or electrical work. None of that is alterations. It's really reconfiguring walls, doing some major types of renovations. And so one of the cases that came down a while ago, it was challenged in court, Almeda, I think it was. It was a city in California where they were sued when they resurfaced the roads. And what the court found was that was indeed an alteration, and then they had to put in curb cuts. So there's ways in which people have been able to advocate to say things like resurfacing a road, you've now you've altered the usability of that, and therefore triggered the requirement for curb cuts as well. So those kind of things come into play. They don't necessarily outline it. They do talk, though. I can't remember if I put in examples or not. What's that? Do they talk about what's a major renovation? I thought I had that in my notes. They talk about, again, things that aren't, like the rewiring, mechanical, re-roofing necessarily. They talk about basically anything that would affect the usability of that room. So even widening a door, right? It's not coming to me offhand. I'll follow up though. I got all your email addresses, and if there's more guidelines when it comes to the renovation piece, but really what I have is what isn't renovation, right? And so, and the resurfacing of the road was a result of a court case that put some clarification on that. Okay. Next, maintain accessible features. As we said earlier, isolated or temporary interruptions may be okay, but if they last for a certain duration of time, that's unreasonable, given the nature of the repair. Geez, forgot again, didn't buy any batteries for that, alternative device that you hook onto your to listen to in a training. Sorry about that. Well, if that goes on for weeks, clearly that's a violation. You can buy batteries. You can buy batteries tomorrow. But if it's an elevator and they need a special part and this part's out of town and there's really nothing we can do about it, it may be that that's going to take longer time, right? So it just depends on what the repair looks like and what the operable feature is and how long it may be down. It'll be a fact-by-fact basis. Okay. Moving on. There is a relationship to Title III of the ADA. There's situations where, like if you've ever been downtown Lansing, you see a lot of government buildings, and then you see cafes occupying the bottom half, right? So there's the relationship between the mandates of the public entity and the mandates of the private business. So Title II and Title III sometimes do come into play that way, because you've got a governmental entity that owns the building, and you've got a Title III private business that's renting the space. And so that may trigger those requirements for both titles. Okay, next slide. I just put this up here just to give you a flavor of the court cases and settlements. So zoning ordinances, there's been some cases that talk about the idea of cities having ordinances for no farm animals or livestock in the city limits, right? Well, under the ADA, someone is allowed to have a miniature horse as a service animal. That's allowed. And so in those situations, the courts have said, look, you've got to modify or allow an exception for a service animal when it comes to your livestock or your farm animal ordinances. Okay. Public schools. This was pretty exciting. Michigan got on the board. We had a case out of Napoleon High School over by Jackson, Michigan, where a young lady who had a dog, I think his name was Golden, I can't remember. It was a golden doodle. I can't remember its name now. But she sued the school wanting access for her service animal, and they said, nope, can't do it, we're not going to do it. Took it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they ruled in her favor. And they said, yes, this is certainly a reasonable request to make of the school. They should have modified their policies about pets. What was interesting about this case, and which was really good, is that there have been several cases that came before this one, Fry versus Napoleon. And what the courts kept saying to our frustration is, no, you can't file a Title II claim. You've got to exhaust your remedies under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So now, what the courts were saying is you've got to go back and go through this whole different law that has a whole administrative, informal kind of resolution before you can go to court, right? ADA doesn't have that. You can file an administrative complaint or you can go to court. Either one. It's okay. And what Fry versus Napoleon, in addition to saying, look, this young woman should have had access to the school with her dog, they said, look, there is not this exhaustion remedy that's required. We are not going to look at cases where someone's saying, well, you didn't follow the administrative remedies under IDEA students, so you can't have this claim for Title II of the ADA. Court said, it's okay. You can file a Title II complaint against the school, and you do not have to exhaust administrative remedies. And we were really excited about that because a lot of cases got bogged down in that, sorry, you got to go back. And they were all very much like this case, dealing with service animals, dealing with accommodations in the school setting. And so that was a very good result that happened. Curb ramps, people have been sued, or cities have been sued over curb ramps. I'll give you a real specific example. They had a beautiful curb ramp, but then they offered a street, it was like a local auto show, kind of, bring your street ride down to the downtown area and set up shop and everybody walks around. Well, the city had blocked several curb cuts to put signs and different types of advertisement up. And so they were sued because they effectively blocked accessible features that should have been accessible or should have been open to someone. Yes? No sidewalks. Right? So the question is, what about sidewalks if you live in an area where there isn't sidewalks provided? They're not required necessarily to do so. would be something that they'd be planning on part of the school, on part of the public entity as to whether they'd pave or start to put in walking paths or sidewalks. But once they do, they have to be accessible. But there's no mandate necessarily to go, or we got to look at all of our, because kids walk to school, we got to look at all of our roads and make sure that there's a walking space to get there. Unfortunately, it wouldn't quite necessarily, I think, fly. We try, but I'm not sure that that one would really meet the mandates under the ADA for protection, right? Voting access, there have been cases that talk about public entities putting screening processes on whether you can get an absentee ballot and how much information you disclose about your disability or mental health condition. Those have been challenged and found to be wrong and needed to be eliminated. Again, that polling place access, if you have every right to go vote in person and you have every right to access that facility to do so. Again, when I used to play a lawyer on TV, I sued the state of Michigan for our voting program here under the ADA. Candace Miller was the Secretary of State at the time. And, you know, we were saying that in Michigan, and we in Michigan have a right to secret ballot. It's not a federal right, it's a state right that we all as citizens of the state of Michigan have. And what we were finding is individuals were going in polling places and they're saying, you need someone to help you, you need to go into, are you voting Republican or Democrat, so we know who to send in polls with you. And what we wanted to say was, look, you have a right to secret ballot voting in Michigan. You've already told us what your program looks like, state of Michigan. We're just telling you now what the ADA mandate says is you need to provide equal access. And what that means is everybody have a right to private voting, right? We ended up suing the state. We made it all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the Department of Justice even stepped in. And it didn't rule in our favor. We had a couple of, I hesitate to say this, but it's true. We had a couple of Reagan appointee judges, and politics plays a role. It really does. And they ruled against us. What was really ironic is the next year, HAVA, Help America Vote Act, came out, right? And so suddenly Michigan got what they said they couldn't possibly figure out how to get before, certain types of accessible voting equipment, right? Like the AutoMark. I don't know if anybody's used it, but there are certain auto or voting machines in the polling places that you can vote independently using SIP and PUF and different things that don't need to have somebody in there with you, right? So voting's been a big deal. Accessible 911, the ability to be able to use that. Lots and lots of criminal justice, jails and correctional facilities, accommodations and barriers, architectural barriers. Website and live streaming. Cities have been dinged for live streaming hearings or public meetings or special meetings, and then not providing captioning and or providing a means of which someone can get that information effectively communicated. Accredited college settings, state examinations, again, those questions about mental health or physical disability, homestead claim we talked about, applications and social media practices as well. Mm-hmm. And right. It's state licensing though, right? The CNA? Laura, yeah. Yeah. So absolutely it can be challenged. I mean, they have the same obligation to provide any type of reasonable modification that a university or accredited college or even a private college would have to provide. They have to provide extra time, quiet space if necessary. It's pretty well litigated. I can't imagine. Maybe we can talk because, all right, yeah, because that's a no-brainer to me. I mean, if you're offering a program or you're offering a certification program or a testing tool, that testing tool needs to be accessible to someone with a disability. Yeah, you do. Yeah. Wasn't available. So she had to wait. She had to wait 6 months. Right. I mean, that's the hardship right there. It's like anybody else could go get their exam and be on their way to get a job and start working, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we should talk because I know like the governor's ADA person too, and maybe we can make something more comprehensive happen. Put our heads together. But yeah, that should be a no-brainer. Modifications to testing is well litigated, well established. Readers, extra time, whatever that individual may say they need, and they're able to support that, it should be something that they have to accommodate. Yeah, 504 rehabilitation. Yep. ADA is mirrored after 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, so a lot of the same obligations, depending on if it's a federal place. Okay, so we are at 5 after 1. We're going to go to 1:15. I just want to say at the get-go, before I start with Title III of the ADA, private accommodations or private businesses, that it's a lot of the same stuff, right? You got to provide those reasonable modifications. You got to look to auxiliary aids and services. Don't have to provide anything that's personal in nature. Can't do a surcharge. Can't suddenly say, look, if you want to use one of these cards, you got to pay us a little money. That kind of thing. And then also with effective communication, the same thing with ensuring effective communication. Now, here, again, as I said earlier, churches, mosques, synagogues, and all their activities are not necessarily in the obligations of Title III of the ADA, unless, again, they pull in some federally assisted program that somehow tags them under Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Next slide. Again, businesses must take steps to provide auxiliary aids and services, and these, again, don't have to be personal in nature. Let's get the next slide. All right, so physical requirements under Title III for architectural accessibility built after, well, they should have been in 1993, but now with the Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act, you're looking at new facilities have a more stringent accessibility requirement that if they're built after 2012 must meet the 2010 standards, and then readily achievable barrier removal. So if you're an existing facility built before 1993, it's only when you make renovations that you have to look at your path of travel to that renovated space. Anything after 1992 should have been accessible according to the guidelines that were filed in 1993. And then in or 2010, the new guidelines came out. So if you're a building built after 2012, you've got even more stringent guidelines when it comes to ADA. Clear? Any questions? Everybody understood that? Perfect. All right. Well, bottom line is we should have a ton of private businesses that are completely accessible with all the new building that's been going up for all the last decade that we've been around, right? Same thing with alterations and renovations. Anything that alters, that changes the effect of usability of the facility and therein is an alteration. Normal maintenance, like re-roofing, painting, wallpaper, changes to mechanical or electrical systems, those are not considered renovations. So according to this, and I knew I had this, renovations include remodeling, reconstruction, could even include historic restoration, changes or rearrangement to the structural parts or elements, or again, the change or rearrangement of configuring of walls are different examples of what they call alterations. All right. Next slide. What are some examples of readily achievable barrier removal? Widening a door, installing a grab bar, building a ramp, changing doorknobs to lever knobs. People have the old, got to twist and turn. Well, someone who has dexterity or limited ability and strength in their hands, you want those, have those level bar. If you look behind me, have the lever bar where they can just hit it with a closed fist as opposed to tight twisting and turning. Reduce the pressure on the door. Many times the doors are too heavy. They have closures that you can just reduce that pressure so it's lighter to open. And then also rearranging furniture and equipment so that there's a better path of travel perhaps, that type of thing. Those are all readily achievable. Now, when it comes to determining what's readily achievable, of course, a private business can say, look, that's too cost prohibitive. We might not be able to afford that. And what the ADA says in those situations, and I'll give you a couple of examples, what they said is that it's an ongoing process, right? So someone goes to a business that they find that maybe they've done some alterations, right? Actually, there's a bar in the Thumb area that did some significant alterations to its bar, but it failed to put in an accessible entrance. Before it had 3 steps going up, and we argued, look, you've got to now make this accessible because you've triggered this change here. And when we approached him, it was winter, and basically he said, look, this is a financial hardship. I can't afford to do this. This is my off season. Don't have any income coming in. I can't do this, right? Came back in the summer when their business was flourishing, and we said, guess what? You got to make your accessible entrance. It's a snapshot picture. So you couldn't afford it then, but it's ongoing. So now, flush in the summer, you got some cash flowing, you can afford it, right? So you can't beg poor because of the season. You're not off the hook. We can keep coming back and asking and saying, you need to provide this, is it readily achievable, and not cost prohibited in some way. Absolutely. You know, it's funny though, because it seems like these would be rather okay things to discuss, but people get rather heated quickly. And you know, I mean, don't come in and mess around with my private business, is what they're saying. Um, right. Yes, yeah, and it's a good point to bring up too. When it comes to landlord situations, it's very specific because you're a private business and you rented it out to somebody to use, like a shopping mall area. Well, I might own the building, but so-and-so runs the place, so I have no obligation to make any of the common areas accessible. They need to worry about their path of travel. No. Unless that private business that owns that building has specifically put that in the lease agreement that the tenant has to take care of all those things, then they're on the hook. They're on the hook for any type of accommodation or change that needs to be made to that building or that space. So that landlord-tenant responsibility doesn't insulate a private business necessarily from still following the ADA's requirements when it comes to providing access to goods and services. We had a real quick case out of the west side of the state where it was a co-op, and it was a pretty rural area, and it was a pretty flourishing cooperative, and they had all their feed and different types of agricultural products and services available to this locality. But it was a very cool building, but it was in an old church. And so you can imagine there were 20 steps leading up to the front entrance. And we worked with them, and they were, you gotta love the hippies. They're always fun to work with. They're always nice, unlike architects. They really worked with us to do that progression where now if you went into the city, you'd see this really long ramp, but it works, right? And they were willing to even go, look, we'll bring out, they took pictures of all their merchandise, we'll bring it out to your car, you tell us what you want, we'll load it up, let you go, if, in the meantime, right? So that's really how it should work. Sometimes it just doesn't work that. People get a little off when it comes to defensiveness, perhaps. All right, next slide. Alternatives have to be available. So like I said, in this co-op situation where they couldn't financially afford to put this huge ramp up at once, so they looked at ways they could bring that service to the individual. And for a while, that was just bringing out saying, hey, what do you need? Put it in your car and off you can go. Those were the days before Amazon and drones delivering it to your doorstep. Okay, next slide. And again, some case law here. Child care centers have been sued over certain policies and practices that discriminate or tend to screen out kids with disabilities. Children must be independently potty trained. Why? In order to access that daycare center. Those types of policies have been challenged. Universities and colleges, that idea of providing accommodations, whether that's suspended test taking, screen readers, large print, convenience stores. This is a good one. I didn't even realize this case existed. There was a case where, I can't remember if it was a Speedway, doesn't matter. It was a convenience store, a chain of convenience stores that were sued because their practice is to take their beautiful sidewalk that has a nice little curb cut and put pop and water and this display and that display. And finally somebody sued and said, look, you can't have an accessible feature and then make it inaccessible, right? And their argument, they were trying to split some hairs by saying, well, that's just minor. You can move those at any time. That's really not a barrier. And the court didn't buy it. He's like, you create the obstruction, you have to, or you create the accessible feature, you have to maintain it. That's very clear in the ADA. And so that was a good case because that's one of my big pet peeves. I'm always going to convenience stores going, step around, and how would someone even access that curb cut all the way up to the front entrance?
They have like the gas tanks that you can buy at like the gas station. They're the big tanks you buy for your grill, but they're on that sidewalk where the
Yep, yeah, the propane.
Yep.
Yeah, so they take that 36 width space and now it's 2 or maybe not even a foot to sort of scoot around. Disney World has been sued over a policy that they don't allow segways, and they've been challenged by someone with a disability to say it's a motorized vehicle, it can be safely used. And that brings up a good point, both in Title I and Title II, is that people might say it's a safety hazard, it's a safety risk, we can't do it because of that. Courts have come back time and time again and said you can't just generally say that. You have to have fact-specific information to say that this is a safety or health reason you're denying this person this right to have this accommodation. So the courts have very much been in favor of you show us what that specific information look like. Can't be general, can't be speculative in nature, it has to be very specific. Restaurants and fast food, the idea of Again, the Burger King had been sued for different types of designs, architectural designs they had in some of their seating. Cruise ships are certainly not immune from it. Hotels, examination exams, admission exams, concerts and venues. There's a lot of cases that are out there that talk about line of sight, right? And make sure that someone has that access or benefit to the line of sight, meaning that, you know, if your seat can be up top row to the left and dispersed, so you have this line of sight. So there's places where somebody can go and they've got a good line of sight like anybody else would choose. This is where I want to sit. I go to the movie theater and my nephew likes to sit right up front. And, you know, you get that screen, and then we're off to the side, and so my head's crooked, and so we're watching Jumanji, and I'm like, yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's really good, you know. I would rather been in the back because they were coming at me like Fast and Furious, and he was just having a good old time. But the line of sight gives that person that equal access anybody would have to choose where they're going to sit. Hockey rinks there are a couple of cases that talked about the path of travel from one hockey rink to another. If you've ever been in a big hockey rink facility, and you've got to make sure that those paths of travels exist. Farmer markets have been sued for accessibility issues. And then, of course, online businesses have been sued a lot for their platforms to become accessible. Okay, I know I jammed through Title III, but again, it's very similar in terms of the mandates for accessibility. And then, of course, there's tax write-offs. Very little do I see these being used and or a way of promoting access. They're necessarily more ignored than anything else most times. But these are certainly what's been available under the ADA for businesses to have an incentive to build and to become more accessible in nature. Yep. So, what's the question again? That I don't know. That's a really good question. Have you heard that? Right? What's my number? Yeah, no, I mean, unlike the Title I is the only one that says 15 or more employees, ADA applies. Title II doesn't matter the size. Could be one person who runs that little local township. Title III doesn't matter the size. You still have to abide by the Title III mandates of the ADA. So those are clear, but I don't know about the tax credits, if that comes into play differently there. It's a very good question. I will say that I just want to give you some really quick statistics in terms of this all being so relevant. So baby boomers, there are 12,500 Americans that turn 50 each day. And by 2029, all baby boomers will be 65 years or older, and they will be the larger population of anyone under 18. So we've got this influx of individuals who, by their age alone, and I'm included, there's going to be some disabling impairments that come up. And right now, when you look at the different generations, it's the baby boomers and their generation tag to have the money, to have the cash, that know how to spend money. And they've saved it long enough to know how to retire and how to do it right. So private businesses have all the incentive in the world to become more accessible, right? I have 5 aunts and uncles who go to casinos all over the state of Michigan constantly. They're in their 70s, right? But they hit every little local bar and restaurant along the way, and they spend a lot of money along the way. And so wouldn't it be great if you were accessible? And so just to kind of leave you with that, is that generationally speaking, I think you're going to see a lot more places being forced to look at modifying and physically and otherwise, because there's just going to be sheer volume of people requesting it, right? All right, that's all I have for you. Thank you.